This is from the most recent National Youth Risk Behavior Survey that the government does. So the most recent data we have is from 2021. But what we started to see here was that over the past decade, we've seen it get worse and worse and worse in terms of essentially clinical depression amongst high schoolers. These are high schoolers endorsing if they've experienced these things in the last year. And you can see that about 40%, over 40%, 42 had basically endorsed clinical depression. About 1 in 5 seriously considered attempting suicide. About 1 in 5 made a plan, and 1 in 10 high school kids in 2021 say they attempted suicide, although only about a third of them made it to a doctor or a nurse due to that attempt. And I know for me, there's a lot of statistics that we could throw up in terms of what kids have been struggling with these past few years in terms of their mental health. This one is the one that I like to use the most, just because it is just right there in your face, and the numbers are so large. Like if you're looking at a classroom of 30 kids, that means that on average 3 of them tried to kill themselves last year. Like, oh my goodness. That to me says we as adults have to do better. They are struggling. We have to help them, and that's a big part, honestly, of why I like to speak about this issue, because I think that there's a lot that we can do, either clinically ourselves, of course, but then also in terms of working with parents. But this period of time that the kids went through with the tremendous amount of just activation and distress, uh, anxiety, has led to not only just behavioral issues and emotional issues, but actually also even changes in their brain. What we found is that if you look at fMRI scans, this one came out the end of 2022, that compared to pre-pandemic kids, right now adolescents have reduced cortical thickness, larger hippocampal volume, and amygdala volume, and more advanced brain age. And ultimately, what that's going to mean for them, we don't know. But a 19-year-old today, their brain looks different than a 19-year-old from 2019. And that, to me, says there's pretty significant implications for where this goes. So let's talk now about what an adverse childhood event is, because we've talked now a bit about just general stress, stress activation. But when we talk about ACEs, which is what they're known as for short, what is an adverse childhood event? The definition is it's a situation that occurs during childhood that provokes a traumatic response. And there's 10 classic ways that ACEs are defined. So physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and then problems in the household related to either an untreated mental illness, where someone's just very symptomatic and very dysregulated in the home. If there's domestic violence going on, going through a divorce and having the family split, having a relative incarcerated and taken away, or if there's substance misuse by someone in the house. These are what we traditionally know as adverse childhood events. And we'll define this in a few slides a little bit more deeply, but ultimately the way you could think about it is that these are all situations that have the propensity to create toxic stress. So basically stress that never really goes away. And that's why when we look at what happened over the course of years during when the pandemic was very active, that's what essentially everybody was going through. But for kids in particular, there were these profound senses of disconnection, particularly when they weren't going to school, they weren't seeing their friends. That was their whole world that changed. They weren't in control of very much. Kids in general don't control much of their lives at all, actually, and so that took even some of the stability that they thought that they had away. And when we think about a traumatic response, keying in on this part for a second. So we'll talk in just a little bit of about a little more specifically, like what is trauma, what is PTSD, how do we define that? But the way that I like to think about it, in terms of just keeping it simple, which I think is very helpful, particularly when you're talking about it with parents, but then also with kids, is that a traumatic response is one where your body responds to the memory or to reminders of the memory as if it's happening again. So like the feelings that you're having aren't ones necessarily that belong in the present. So like And that's how I would define also a traumatic memory. It's one where the memory recreates the old feelings rather than engendering the new ones. So, like as an example, when I was in grad school, my graduate assistant advisor, who I'd worked with for 4 years, actually died very suddenly. She died of a heart attack, and it was extremely distressing at the time. I remember that it was actually the first open casket funeral I'd ever been to, and I just remember being in this funeral home and being like the only one crying, which to me also just felt awful. I was like sitting in the middle of this room with my then girlfriend, now wife, but just bawling my eyes out and just feeling all the more alone because like no one else seemed to be crying. And I can talk about that now, and I don't feel like crying. Like I can think about it. It might create some emotion, I'm not feeling the same emotion all over again. And when we think about when is a memory or an experience traumatic, at least in a clinical sense, it's one where it reproduces the feelings that you had when you were there. And these sorts of things, or these adverse childhood events in particular, they are very common. Actually, 61% of people report experiencing at least one of these 10 traditional ACEs options. And when you break it down a little bit more and how many have people experienced, uh, a little over 1 in 10 people, 12.5% have experienced four or more. But again, most of us are experience something like this, more of us than not, in some way, shape, or form. How, again, it breaks down if we look at it a little bit differently. Again, this is from the CDC's large ACEs survey that they did a few years back. The most common type of ACEs is physical abuse, unfortunately for kids, followed by substance, I'm going to use the word misuse instead of abuse. We're trying to phase that word out. But substance misuse in the home, divorce right behind that. But all of these numbers are a lot higher than honestly we'd ever want them to be. And I think, that's unfortunately just a virtue of where we're at right now as a society, and needing to really work with parents and also then provide people with help. I think a lot of this ends up being generational, where someone had themselves a very rough childhood, and it tends to work its way down that way. Now, aside though from the fact that just going through something like this it can be incredibly distressing just in and of itself. The reason why we talk about ACEs so much is that they are linked to a lot of other very negative health conditions. And this goes from everything from chronic health conditions like heart disease, stroke, asthma, to health risk behaviors like smoking and drinking and substance misuse, as I mentioned before, to social outcomes like unemployment and not graduating, to mental health concerns like depression. And in fact, it's actually, there's a tremendous increase in the chances that people will develop these problems if they have more, if they go through more ACEs, is what we found. So what we found is that if someone has had four or more of these occur to them, that their chances of CPD or COPD are 2.5 times higher. Depression is 4.5 times higher, 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. Ideally, we really want to limit the number of those ACEs qualifying events that young people go through. And part of the reason why I mentioned the past few years is I think that there's a very strong case to be made that living through the pandemic was an ACE in and of itself. Now, again, to frame why this is important in a different way, when we look at the potential reduction of negative outcomes in adulthood, when we factor out ACEs, when we do statistical analyses and we say, if someone didn't go through what they went through, what are the chances that, what percentage of these cases would we see go away? We'd see almost half the amount of depression. 21 million cases of depression could potentially be prevented. A lot less COPD, asthma, 2.5 million cases of obesity. You can see some of these are more strongly related than others, but it's all pretty intense. There are some folks who would say, and I think that there's a lot of justification to this, that if you had to pick just one issue to focus on, that if we got at it and reduced its impact, would have the greatest ripple effect across our society, it would probably be the emotional lives of our children. and of what they're going through right now because of just how broad of an impact it has. And then we'll get back to the question of, so like how would, having someone at home with untreated like bipolar disorder lead to someone having more problems with asthma in their life or having more problems with stroke or cancer. We'll get back to that in just a second, but it's because there's this ripple effect of toxic stress, to come back to that idea again, when you're just constantly activated. Now, talking about risk factors for a second, um, there these are risk factors, so that doesn't mean that it's going to happen if a caregiver has these characteristics, but kids are more likely to have gone through more ACEs if they have caregivers who are or were neglected or abused themselves as children. If they were young single parents or they've got a bunch of children, if they either have a lower degree of educational attainment or of income, if they use corporal punishment for discipline, if they are under a high degree of parenting or economic stress, or they have our attitudes that justify violence or aggression. Also, we found that if you live in a community that has high violence and crime, poverty and unemployment, access to drugs, and numbers of latchkey kids, or kids who basically aren't supervised after school and do as they please, that those are also associated with someone having gone through more ACEs than they otherwise might have. So if we sum all of this up, what we're looking at here is an environment with a very high degree of chaos, of instability, of danger and disconnection, in very various amounts when you look at those bullets. But that's the vibe, and you can imagine how, like, if that's what you're growing up and you just think that that's normal, that creates a certain sense of tension, certain expectancies, certain reactivities that we'll talk about a little more as we go along.